Among the scariest things ever seen, one of the worst is the skinwalkers. Many people say that they are just human-looking animals, but in today's video you will see that they are much more than that. But first, if you're new here, remember to subscribe to the channel. The channel's goal is to get 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I think we can achieve it, so please sign up. Now let's move on to the first story. Appalachian Mountains. I want to start by saying that I'm a very skeptical person. I became an atheist at 17, and when my belief in God dissipated, so did my belief in everything supernatural. I also want to say that I have lived in Appalachia my entire life, and I am almost 22 years old. I've never experienced any of the scary things people say about the Appalachian Mountains until the story I'm about to tell. At the end of last year, which was 2023, two of my friends and I had a sort of simultaneous quarter-life crisis, which led us to get rid of almost all of our belongings, quit our jobs, leave our apartments, and live in our cars, making deliveries across the country. On our first night of the big trip, we went to stay with a friend of one of my traveling companions. She lived in Tennessee in the Appalachian Mountains in the Smoky Mountains, specifically Al, which for those of you who don't know is like a subcategory of Appalachian. She lived on a country road in the middle of the forest. The first night we were there, she told us that there were strange occurrences on the property. The house was haunted and there was something in the woods. She told us that whatever was in the woods liked to hang out near her shed. She said that one night she was going up to the porch when she had an overwhelming feeling of being trapped. Fed up with it all, she shouted something like, "Go away, you monster," into the forest, only for it to shout the same thing back at her. She claimed to have seen this thing one night through her kitchen window. He said he was peering around the shed, looking at her. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. Out of curiosity, I asked her to describe in more detail what she saw, but she refused. Being the skeptic that I am, I basically disregarded everything she said and forgot about it. As it was our first night on the trip and it was so fun and new for us, we decided to sleep in our cars, which were parked right in front of the warehouse I mentioned earlier. Yes, that shed. We hadn't made window coverings yet, so we were sleeping in 3 SUVs with uncovered windows, completely exposed, but I didn't bother with that. I thought the worst that could happen would be waking up to a bear staring at me. So I went to sleep peacefully and woke up in the middle of the night really needing to pee. I half-dressed, put on my shoes, got out of the car, walked to the edge of the forest, did my business, went back to the car, and went back to sleep. I didn't have a care in the world, no feeling of discomfort, no feeling of being watched, nothing. The next night I once again woke up needing to pee badly. So, like I did the night before, I sat up in bed, put on my pants, put on my shoes, and reached for the door handle, but I couldn't open it. It was as if all the hair on my body stood up, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. At that moment, I had a makeshift bed in the back of my SUV, on top of the back seats that I had lowered. So I'm there, in my bed, looking around through my uncovered windows. I can't see anything outside except the faint outlines of trees and the glow of my traveling companions' cars. I didn't see or hear anything that made me nervous. I reached for the door handle again, but once again I felt that terrible feeling. I kept looking around, tried to reach the door handle, and took my hand away. I finally gave up and thought, screw this, and peed into an empty water bottle. The next morning I woke up and was talking to my traveling companions, and one of them mentioned that he woke up in the middle of the night out of nowhere and had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. She sat on her makeshift bed and looked around but saw nothing. I'm not going to lie. When she said that, I felt a knot in my stomach. I asked her what time it was when this happened, and she estimated it was around the same time I woke up, around 3 a.m. So I told them about my experience, and we were all a little scared by it. As we were heading to our cars the next night, we noticed that all 5 of the homeowners' pet cats were sitting on the front porch, which we hadn't seen the previous 2 nights. Typically, they were scattered around the property, if we saw them at all. We thought it was strange, but we didn't think much about it. We all got in our cars and said our goodnights over our walkie-talkies. It was a pretty hot and humid night for October, so we all had our battery-powered fans on. One of my friends, frustrated, reported that her walkie-talkie was dying. Then my other friend reported that her fan had stopped working. Then my walkie-talkie started to fail, and it continued until in the space of 5 minutes, all of our camping electronics, walkie-talkies, flashlights, and fans had stopped working. Finding this incredibly scary, we all decided that we should sleep in the house to be safer. We were collecting all our things when I started hearing what sounded like something big moving through the leaves in the forest. We were packing up our things. I stopped what I was doing and looked at my friend, who was very close to the forest. He seemed unconcerned every time, so I continued what I was doing. It was then that I heard a louder noise coming from the forest and finally decided to go to my friends. It turns out that one of them was on guard duty while the others gathered the rest of their things. My friend and I stood there watching our other friends back, and it continued to feel like whatever was in the forest was getting closer to us. Soon, my friend gathered all her things and we entered the house calmly but quickly. As I recall, we slept at the house the next night as well, but the night after that, one of my friends took some sage from the house owner and burned sage along the wood line and around our vehicles before leaving. Get ready for bed. We slept perfectly well that night, and every night after that. There were no more strange sensations, noises, nothing. Of course, we've been on constant alert since then, but I've never felt the same fear and foreboding that I felt before. To be honest, I don't know what to think of all this. I know I didn't see anything, but the feeling I got was unlike anything I've ever experienced in my life, especially coming out of nowhere. I've told this story a few times, and some people have told me it could just be a bear. But I don't think a bear would give me that instinctive sense of danger when I couldn't even hear or see it. I'm fully aware that I may be biased now, but after this experience, I gave the homeowner's stories a little more credibility. For those who are curious, no, unfortunately, we are no longer on the trip. It all fell apart after a few months, and we are now reintegrating back into society. However, we are all still friends. And no, we haven't experienced anything like that again, despite having stayed at several campsites deep in the woods in other parts of the Southeast. I think I saw a skinwalker about 2 months ago. My husband, age 34, and I, age 29, were in an RV on my friend's property in northern Wisconsin. One night I wasn't feeling very well, so I went to lie down in the trailer and quickly fell asleep. A few hours later, around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly, ran out the door, and started vomiting violently outside by the window. My husband called me and asked if I was okay. I managed to say yes. I'm scared to move. He's just watching me, I whispered almost to myself. He opened the trailer door and looked into the darkness. Where? He asked, unable to see what I was seeing. It's right in front of me, just watching, I said, confused that he couldn't see it. He took a flashlight and shined it in front of me, and there was nothing there. I never saw him leave, kept his gaze cold, and died all the time. How could it not be there? I'm still very confused by this interaction. I know it was there. I saw it. It wasn't a dream, and I know I wasn't hallucinating. Can anyone tell me what they think it was? It's just to respond to some comments. I don't drink or use drugs, so I wasn't drunk. I don't remember all the details because I couldn't see very well, but here's what I have. I couldn't tell how tall it was because from what I could see, it appeared to be hunched over and disfigured. I don't think it had fur. It was pale, but again, it was very dark, and I'm not sure what color it was. He had big black eyes without a soul, like looking straight into a void. It had sharp, jagged teeth, and I don't remember a nose. I hope this description helps. Maybe it wasn't a skinwalker because I don't think they leave Navajo land, but it was really scary. I should also mention that I was in the forest of Wisconsin, which was not far from the Indian reservation Hanville, not County Menominee, Michigan, but again, it wasn't Navajo, so I'm not sure what it was. (2017) Skinwalker Personal History. I'd like to apologize in advance, as I like to think I'm a good storyteller in person, but quite mediocre and long-winded in text. Also, as I write later, I try to use animal sounds to describe some noises. Take this with a grain of salt, as even I know it's not exactly what I heard, but the closest sound I can relate or describe. I alternate between I and we a few times when describing because in the end, my friends and I discuss what happened to confirm that we all indeed heard the same thing and had the same experience. To contextualize the story and where it is set, I grew up in the Huron region of Ontario. For those who aren't familiar, it's about a 3-hour drive directly west of Toronto, where I now live on the shore of Lake Huron, not far from the area where the stories of the Black Donnellys come from for the history lovers darkening. During my time in high school, there was a teacher who talked about his experiences in a small forested place called Lobbs Bush. Although I wasn't very familiar with it at the time, it was known by a good number of locals as a very haunted place in the area where people had had unexplained but surprisingly similar encounters. This professor was very candid about his experiences in those woods, but also about his unshakable confidence in being a non-believer in the paranormal or supernatural, which in turn made him, of all people, the most fascinating to listen to. He always ended his stories or responded to questions with, "I don't believe it, I can't explain it. I'm just telling you what happened." A few years later, in the winter of 2017, After having him as my teacher in high school and after moving away for my first year of university, I returned to my hometown for the winter break to spend time with family and reunite with my group of friends. For those familiar with the small town experience, our favorite activity was the classic of buying an awful lot of cheap cigarettes from the reservation, getting into one of our friends' ramshackle cars and smoking, talking, and playing the worst music ever conceived until the cigarettes or gasoline ran out. We were all between 16 and 18, so this was the most fun way to generate things to do. Plus, finally, having a break from all the university work was great. This was the first time I had seen these friends in a few months, so we were all excited to be together again in a big group. I won't bore you with all the previous shenanigans of the night, but where this story begins is after we drive around and talk for a few hours. We stopped at a random bush trail so some of us could smoke weed. As we began walking along one of the trails, I remember feeling a very sudden change in the atmosphere around us. I didn't really want to express my feelings to avoid ruining the mood, but I definitely felt the need to be on high alert. I never had a way to describe the physical sensation other than my chest feeling heavy. But somehow it was very clear that something was watching us and didn't want us to be there. Every few steps I had to look back to make sure something wasn't following us. All we had were our cell phone flashlights, which illuminated a short distance. The way the trail was in the woods, all the trees were young and bent over the path, forming almost a tunnel. It felt like we were entering the mouth of a gigantic creature slowly moving down its throat. We only walked a few meters before realizing that the calm night was turning into a winter storm. We all agreed to get back in the car and start heading home before it got any worse. When we got back to the car, the trees were swaying violently from the wind and snow, made it difficult to see a few meters ahead. Once in the car, we began driving back to the nearest town to stay at a friend's house and wait out the storm. As we drove, the weather continued to worsen until the snow practically blinded us. As we rounded a notable turn halfway through, we discovered that our estimate of how far to turn the car was not enough, and we felt the car's inertia decrease and slide. After a short period of us throwing accusations of defensive driving and general frustrations, we ended up staying in the pit for about 5 hours before being rescued by local police and taken the rest of the way into town. During our time in the pit, I talked about how I felt walking in the forest. We all agree on the feeling of knowing we shouldn't be there, but none of us have spoken up until now. Only after that did our friend in the driver's seat, the only one familiar with these particular back roads, inform us that we were, in fact, walking through the Lob Woods. Fast forward a bit. I believe that in my second semester, reading week, I'm back at home with my friends and back to the same old shenanigans. After a particularly good night of catching up, we decided to revisit Lob Woods, as neither of us had been there since we were trapped in the pit, and the weather was already warm this month, with much less snow. I remember feeling almost excited about returning. Instead of dark, impenetrable clouds and snow, that night the moon was visible, and we barely needed flashlights to see where we were going. We parked the car in the same place and got all the necessary smoking equipment, a pack of cigarettes for the driver, and meat to share. Of course, neither time were we dumb enough to get our designated driver high. As we started walking along the trail, I started to recognize landmarks that I had missed the first time I was there, with the moonlight making everything more visible. I passed the same threshold as before and was pleasantly surprised that I didn't feel like I was being watched or not welcome there. After a while, I almost forgot I was in the famous forest and was enjoying an evening walk with my friends, laughing. After walking further along the trail, we finally reached an opening on the right side of the trail. The trees parted to show the edge of the field, brightly lit by moonlight. On the left side, the bush faded away, creating a beautiful section of grass and light foliage, setting out to show a small stream running through the site. It looked like a naturally formed auditorium, with the stream running through it as a main path. Sparse trees provided plenty of seating for the audience, and the opening of the trees led to the farmer's field, serving as a stage. To be honest, I had completely forgotten that we were there to smoke and was just enchanted by the beauty of the place. While we were finding a place to stop and prepare our lighters, our friend had the brilliant idea of exclaiming, "Wow, I forgot I bought a Roman candle." When we all turned to look, he had already taken out his lighter and was starting to light the candle. Again, we were teenagers. We were idiots. He then directed the candle toward the large clearing in the field, moving it every now and then so that it didn't always hit the same spot, going higher and higher in the air. Finally, he pointed it in the opposite direction, toward the woods, with surprising accuracy. None of the shots actually hit anything before they went out, until one finally hit a tree near the creek and spun into the woods where we couldn't see it. No more than a second passed before a piercing, terrifying scream arose from exactly where the Roman candle had shattered into the woods beyond our vision. We all froze completely, not knowing what to do, as the scream continued for a worrying time. I can only describe the scream as a mix between a deeper version of a monkey's roar and a high-pitched sound reminiscent of an elk bellowing, increasing in pitch as the scream persisted. I remember my ears were ringing so loudly I wanted to cover them, but we were all frozen in place. Finally, one of us woke up to reality and shouted, "Run!" And we ran towards the farmer's field. We all started running away from the scream that continued to come from the woods. As we ran, the screaming finally stopped after about 10 seconds of constant noise. There was no pause or change in the scream other than the tone. It could scream at that volume for longer than I've ever heard any animal do. Before we could think, we heard a loud noise in the forest, as if something was taking a deep breath to scream again. The breath was as terrifying as a crocodile's roar mixed with a hyena's laughter. Although both sounds I am describing are exhalation, it was clear that this was a guttural, deep, preparatory inhalation before the scream. Unlike the first scream, which seemed reactive and surprised by the fireworks, that sound was clearly an angry roar. Whatever it was really quite big, with the lungs to prove it. Now, towards us, the sound was even louder and seemed to be aimed at us. Even though we were all heavy smokers at the time, we ran as fast as we could without looking back, absolutely terrified by the second continuous roar that was approaching us. After about 15 seconds, the scream stopped abruptly. It took a second for us to realize the noise was gone. We looked back and saw that we had left the forest and arrived at the field. We only looked briefly to see that we were about 50 to 100 meters away from the edge of the forest. Even before we could think straight, we hesitantly agreed to head to the nearest road to get back to where we had parked. It was only when we reached the road and caught our breath, still panting, that one of us finally asked if everyone had heard and felt that. We chatted briefly, but we were too nervous to actually talk. About 20 minutes later, we finally got to the road and saw the car. We began to calm down as we had time to process and let the adrenaline subside. We unlocked the car, got into our respective seats with our backpacks, and had time to get it out before the first scream happened. As the driver finally started the car and the headlights illuminated the forest in front of us, the front passenger just shouted, "Drive, drive, drive!" The driver, without looking, put the car in reverse and turned to quickly get out and hit the country road as quickly as he could. Next to the bush, the friend who screamed started to freak out again. I was sitting directly behind him with my hand on his shoulder in the back seat. We tried asking what was going on while I looked over my shoulder into the forest. I genuinely felt like time had slowed down as I looked with the same feeling of something watching me as my first time in the forest. As the trees passed by, I could clearly make out two wide-open eyes reflecting back at me. I could clearly distinguish two complete reflective circles. I was completely frozen and couldn't look away. I couldn't tell if the eyes were fixed on me, the entire vehicle, or even what light they were reflecting as we were driving alongside the forest. They were clearly further into the forest, a few meters away, so I couldn't make out their height, but I could see that they were attached to a head much larger and taller than a human's. I completely forgot to comfort the passenger in front of me and tried to turn around and see longer through the back window as we continued driving, but I had completely lost sight. I couldn't even make a sound, but my mind was racing. The longer I sat, the more I wondered how the hell it got to a point where I could see it after we quickly drove away from the parking lot. I don't know how much he saw of the car, but I know he saw me and all of us in that forest. I don't know how to describe it other than feeling like I was totally the prey and that whatever it was now knew me as a predator. After driving for a while on the way to a friend's farm, we were all able to talk about what had happened. We all hear the same sounds. I heard the whispering, heard the same distant screams for too long, and finally the other passenger and I agreed that we were seeing the same wide eyes watching us. Neither of us could see exactly what it was, but we both agreed that it was staring us in the face and was too big to identify. This passenger also commented that although he was a few meters away in the forest, what he saw had to be much larger than a human being. After a few more hours of talking about it, we finally felt comfortable heading back to our respective homes. Every few months, when we met again, we assured each other that we had all seen the same thing, as we wanted to make sure that none of us were truly losing our sanity. I spent about a year reflecting on the events of this story, not knowing exactly who to share it with or who would believe us. When I finally felt comfortable talking about and researching similar things, I came to the personal conclusion that it could be something similar to a skinwalker, and started investigating more into stories related to this, as there was a lot of talk about people having similar encounters or strange happenings in Lobbs Bush. I really wanted to explore and research all the possibilities. Also, although Ray was a bit of a Christian in school, it was never a dogma I really followed or was very involved in until this happened. For me, if this was real and happened to me, I couldn't prove otherwise, and it drastically changed the way I view any form of religion or spiritual beliefs. Through friends and a few events, I met a good number of indigenous groups and older members who I felt believed enough in the ancient traditions to tell the story. All three elders said essentially the same thing with a very direct line. Yes, that looks like a skinwalker, and some shared similar encounters that other friends and family had had. Just in the last 2 years, I've talked to a few more people about this, and a friend finally recommended that I look up what a skinwalker is. When I looked online, I heard very similar sounds that sent me the same chills that I was being watched. I felt that this, in addition to everything that had happened, was confirmation enough for me. And to this day, I've begun my own spiritual path with respect to the lands, and essentially now, I am on Turtle Island where I walk. In addition to the classic warnings about not whistling or mentioning your name at night, I have made it very clear to my friends who have heard the story and know me as a fellow camping lover that if I ever feel anything like being watched or not, we should be in that forest, they would come out with me immediately. I investigate scary cases. Here are my stories. I usually start these stories with some kind of message about police work, but today all I have for you is this. Life sucks. It was a rainy October night, and I had recently moved to the homicides department after a long hiatus. It was a department I was familiar with and initially loved being a part of. However, in light of certain events, I felt I needed to leave for the sake of my own mental health. That said, after a few years investigating some of the most disturbing cases known to man, strangely enough, the murder became somewhat benign. But more than that, I know it would provide a distraction. Personally, I was past the point where I would rather have my thoughts consumed by how to catch a killer than the growing number of monsters that seemed to appear out of nowhere. When I arrived at the apartment complex, I remember thinking how strange it was that a place full of life could be so focused on death. The way people moved in and around the scene was like a colony of ants. Each individual does his work independently of the others. However, the collective end goal remained the same, to find out exactly what happened and who did it. I was hoping that because it was so late, we would get less prying eyes. But as I looked around, I realized that the presence of the morbidly curious tenants was apparent. It was understandable. People don't see murders every day. They are scared, curious, and fascinated all at the same time. It's an event so different from most people's normal that it's hard not to look. But still, part of me wants them to stay inside and save themselves from the trauma that will undoubtedly arise later. Seeing a body died, it's something that never goes away. I scanned the crowd of police officers and forensic experts looking for a familiar face. Fortunately, it only took a moment for me to find him, and he smiled and waved as I approached. Officer Ryan stood between two other patrol officers wearing his signature smile. The officer next to Ryan looked at me for a moment, confused, before blurting out, "Smith, you went back to the homicides? I thought you were done after, what happened?" I responded with a nervous laugh. "Just a short break, Officer Bailey. I always came back." I looked past him for a moment to take a look at the body. "What do we have on the victim?" Officer Ryan sighed and shook his head. Motioning for me to follow, we took a short walk to the body. Call it a bloody mess would be an understatement. The man's entire face and chest were sunken. Large pieces of meat were uprooted on your neck, and it looked like his right arm had been crushed into the pavement. The way the body had been mutilated, it disturbed me deeply, and it was difficult not to choke up when I saw the man. "So," Officer Ryan began, "as you can see, we have severe blunt force trauma, polite and bruises consistent with a fight. So far, no one we've spoken to has seen anything, but we have a 911 caller waiting to talk to you." After getting the summary, I went to inspect the body more closely. As mentioned earlier, we were looking at an extraordinarily brutal attack. Thinking out loud, there seemed to be only one logical conclusion. This has to be personal. There is no way anyone would desecrate a body like that if he was killed by a stranger, unless they didn't want him identified, but even then, it's excessive. "Maybe he had something of value," Officer Ryan added. "He gets into an argument with someone trying to steal his stuff and they do it to throw us off?" I wasn't convinced. When I went to check his pants pockets, my suspicions were apparently confirmed. I don't think so. His wallet and keys are still here, so it probably rules out a robbery. Opening his wallet, I found an ID belonging to a Mr. Ernie Garrison. I am 58 years old. We would still need someone to positively identify the body, but now we could very likely put a face on the subject. I called an evidence collector to come and take the items away while I continued to search the body. When I went to look at his neck and trapezius, my eyes widened, and I immediately shouted for the crime scene photographer to come and take a look. Embedded in the man's flesh were 3 yellow teeth. The man I assumed to be Mr. Bennett died only an hour ago at most, but the skin and muscles around the teeth were already rotting. The look on his face mirrored mine, pure disgust mixed with confusion. While none of us have a deep understanding of biology or the human body, we understand enough to know that it doesn't rot that quickly. Nor should it rot in just one place, while the rest remains immaculate. I was already feeling the vibration of something deeply wrong. Preliminary thoughts were gathering in my mind that I wanted no part of. Ideas about what the hell could have done this froze me for a second. Could the tall woman have brutalized this person, or something else? Once I regained my composure, I simply mentioned to my team that we needed to remove those teeth and checked with forensics to see if they matched any DNA we had on file. As soon as I'm done with the body, I hear a faint buzzing sound. Instinctively, I go to check my phone, but I realize it's not me. It takes me a second to locate where the sound came from, but eventually I spot a soft blue light emanating from a nearby trash can. Walking there, I discover a phone. I immediately noticed bloodstains on the cover. Pressing the home button takes me to a background image of a man who looked a lot like a slightly younger Roger Garrison, and a dog. A missed call was the title on the notification bar. A quick swipe not only shows me that Mr. Garrison doesn't keep a password, but that he also has a text message from someone saved as idiot. Idiot? I said to myself. What are the chances that it's a mere coincidence that he's in contact with someone he obviously has a problem with at the same time he's died? I took the phone to another evidence collector and told her to keep it safe and secure for me at the station. After doing the rounds and talking to the other detectives about what I had discovered, it was time to talk to the person who called 911, Miss Eva Braunstein. I found her waiting outside her apartment door. I introduced myself and started by asking her what the original 911 call was about. The tremor in her voice indicated that she was still trying to deal with the stress. I was watching TV when I heard a loud noise outside. I think they were beats. I guess I just assumed one of the downstairs neighbors was doing some work or something. I know it's late and it seems strange, but I wanted to mind my own business. The knocking continued for a while, and I'm sure Ernie had gotten tired of it. Poor man. She shook her head. I heard him yelling that he was going to kick someone's you-know-what and slam the door. The next thing I know, it looks like there's a fight outside. He's shouting profanities at the top of his lungs and telling someone to get off him. That's when I called the police, but after I hung up the phone, there was only silence. Did you happen to stick your head out and see something? I asked. She nodded. When things got quiet, I peeked out the window and saw Ernie's body lying there all bloody. No one near him. And you didn't go out to check if he was still alive? Son, I'm 74 years old and grew up in Brooklyn. If there is a dead body out there, the last thing you do is hang around. There was no arguing. Did you happen to know at least who he went to confront? And do you happen to know anyone who would do that to Ernie? She thought for a moment, but finally shook her head. No, I'm not sure who Ernie was going to see. I know he had a problem with one of the neighbors, but he never told me who it was. As for who would do this, no one that I can think of. Ernie had a temper, of course, but overall he's a nice guy. Other than that neighbor, he never mentioned having any real problems with anyone. Are there friends or family we can ask? No, he has no children, wife, or siblings, and his parents died years ago. I'm one of the few people he talks to, if anyone else. Not that I wanted to call her a liar, but it was hard to believe that a man who seemingly had no ties was brutally killed that way. But between the phone, the teeth, and the neighbor's lead, I felt like we had a pretty solid basis to investigate. When I finished the interview, she made one last nasty comment. I know Ernie was a fighter. He always carried a golden pocket knife with his initials inscribed on it. When you find out who did this, I swear to God they will have scars from this. When I finally got back to the police station, the first thing I wanted to see was that phone. I almost flew to the evidence to retrieve the device, and I was as giddy as a child on Christmas morning when I got the chance to see its contents. A few other detectives and Officer Ryan crowded around my desk as I read what appeared to be a heated argument between him and his neighbor, Alan Wong. In short, they seemed to be arguing about the loud beats. Mr. Wong appeared to claim that he was not the one making the noise and asked Mr. Garrison not to investigate. The two had a continuous back and forth, which eventually led to Mr. Garrison leaving to confront whoever was outside, which led us here. This was critical. The lab wouldn't give us the DNA results for a while, but we probably had a direct witness to who killed Mr. Garrison. If we could identify who was out there at the time, then DNA would just be the icing on the cake. In any case, this all depended on Alan Wong's testimony. Finding his apartment once we had the name wasn't difficult, nor was it difficult to get him to agree to talk after politely informing him that if he was withholding information regarding a case of murder active, he would be in trouble. It took me a short ride downtown to start evaluating him in the interrogation room. There were no policies or bruises on your body, no stains blood. For one murder so brutal, you would absolutely expect there to be signs. But one thing was apparent. Mr. Wong was nervous. Even if he wasn't the perpetrator, he knew something. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead and his eyes seemed bulging, moving from side to side as if he were searching for something. "How are you today, Mr. Wong?" I asked, trying to break the tension. He gave a nervous laugh. "Crazy question to ask considering the circumstances. Can we get straight to the point?" "Fair. I guess the first thing I'd like to know is, how did you meet Ernie Garrison?" "I fix things, and one day he asked me to help fix his car because he thought I would be cheaper than a regular handyman." "Okay, so you helped him and what? Was everything okay between you two? Did you guys talk again after that, or?" He shrugged. "What I mean to say, there was a bit of a dispute, I guess you could say. Nothing important, though. A man dies after a dispute with a neighbor, an unfortunate but classic story. The pieces were starting to come together in my head. And what was this dispute about? Payment for my services. I'm a fair guy, but he was giving me a low price. I tried to give him something below what he would pay elsewhere, but that wasn't good enough. Just because the guy is my neighbor doesn't mean I'm going to do the work for free, you know? After threatening to take him to court, he pays, but he starts complaining about everything. Noise, my dog. He said he thought he smelled drugs from my apartment, just a bunch of shit. The guy was trying so hard to kick me out. It seems harsh. You must have hated the guy. Hate is a strong word. We weren't friends, but I would never wish anything bad on him. It was just stupid. Hey man, I get it. This is fair. The problem here, of course, is that the man has died. So what I want you to do is tell me in your own words what you think happened." The change in behavior was quick. I could hear his foot tapping rapidly now, and he choked a little when he spoke. I have no idea. I just know that the guy died. It's sad as hell, but I don't have much to add." "Nonsense. That's strange, Mr. Wong, because we know you were the last person to communicate with Mr. Garrison, and that he came to your house to talk to you. Add in the fact that you two had clear issues, and it certainly points to more than a coincidence." Although he shook his head, I could tell from the expression on his face that he wanted to say something more. "Look, Alan, I'll be frank with you. I've already said that if you are hiding information, you need to talk to us. Right now, you may be facing accusations of murder if it comes back to you. And you can make me tell the prosecutor that you were honest or that you tried to hide shit the whole time. What is going to be?" He scoffed and slammed his hand on the table before pointing a finger at me. "Don't do that. I had nothing to do with his death. You think I don't know how serious this is?" He let out a loud moan and placed his hands on his head as tears began to form in his eyes. "This is so fucked up. If I'm being seen as suspected of murder, the last thing I want to do is tell the truth and look ridiculous." He was starting to panic. I took that as my cue to stand up and let him have some time to think. As I walked out the door, I turned around and let him know to just give me his truth, as ridiculous as it sounded. After 20 minutes alone, he was ready to talk. I expected a confession, hopefully some story about how anger drove him and an accomplice to a murder. Horrible, but easy. Open and closed. What I got, however, was much more disturbing. Mr. Wong went on to tell a story about how he was late one night throwing out his trash when he saw something he only called an abomination across the street. Apparently, as soon as they made eye contact, this abomination came at him, and his only option was to run inside and hide. He could hear the bang, bang, bang as this thing tried to escape the door. Mr. Garrison apparently heard the noise and thought it was Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong tried to convince him to stay inside and stay away. Still, Mr. Garrison didn't accept it and subsequently ended up dead. When asked why Mr. Wong didn't just tell Mr. Garrison about the creature, he just laughed and said, "Do you think he would have believed it? I wouldn't expect the person who trusted me most in the world to believe it, much less someone who obviously hates me. He would have come anyway. In fact, it was a ridiculous story, one that I'm sure almost everyone out there watching the interview was laughing at. Did an abomination from the darkness attack you? Yes, right, except, yeah, right. The way he talked about what he saw and the genuine fear in his eyes as he recalled the memories were familiar. I was familiar with this behavior because I had experienced exactly this personally. Our conversation continued for a while after that, but I eventually let him go. I let him know I would stay in touch, but deep down, I knew I would never see him again because he just wasn't our guy. I don't know if it was for my own mental well-being or respect for due process, but I needed to hold on to the idea that this wasn't another being from hell who had come to wreak havoc on society. I needed to see this through and make sure I wasn't dealing with the standard kind of darkness we see in human beings. For all intents and purposes, Mr. Wong didn't know what he saw, and it could easily be the work of some local maniac. It took a few weeks, but when the DNA profile came back on the teeth and other evidence we collected, things started to look bleak. No matches. Simultaneously, as we did more research on Mr. Wong, we found no trace of his DNA at the scene, nor did we find any evidence that he was communicating with third parties to set up some kind of undercover work. Murderer. Additionally, searches of his home computer at the time of the 911 call indicate that he was inside using his desktop at the time of the call. Murder. Even possible security camera footage from the area revealed nothing. If Mr. Wong was involved, there was no hard evidence to show it. Our two best leads were drying up, and over time, Mr. Garrison's case followed the path of many murders before it. Cold. The days passed, and with no new leads, we had to try something new. I convinced the chief to hold a press conference and ask the public for information. The hope was that if someone recognized the types of injuries, or Ernie Garrison himself, maybe they could plug some of the gaps we were ignoring. The tips that arrived at the beginning were of little or no help. It was mostly people suggesting completely random names, maybe a creepy uncle or ex-boyfriend. Heck, we even got some suggestions that a bizarre set of forest stairs or skinwalkers were to blame. Honestly, I don't know what to do with any of them. I've heard stories of both, and to put it simply, no. I'll stay away from both of those things. The point is that we weren't getting anywhere, just wasting time chasing dead ends. At least, until I heard a familiar voice on the phone one late night at work. She seemed nervous about speaking at first. "Hello, is that Detective Smith?" "Yes, speaking, and who is it?" I never gave her a name when we last spoke, but this is Maria Alvarez, nurse at the old hospital. We talked in the parking lot after... What happened? The words old hospital brought back a flood of memories that made me shudder. The hermit's face flashed in my mind, and I reflexively turned toward an air vent above me just to make sure there was nothing hidden inside it. "Yes, I remember you, clear. How are you, Miss Alvarez?" She let out a sigh. "I'm in control. What you told me back then, it's been on my mind a lot lately, and it's given me a different perspective. I don't know, I just feel like the world became a much scarier place almost overnight." "Yes? Sorry to hear that. Seriously. It's okay, or at least tolerable. I saw your press conference, by the way, and that made me think a little, you know? Lots of thought about what could have happened to that poor man, and yet the more I thought, the more I realized I might have an idea. An idea of what?" She was silent for a moment, but I could hear movement on the other end. Then a hushed whisper came. "Technically, I shouldn't be sharing this with anyone because of patient confidentiality. A while ago, someone arrived with similar injuries at night, bite marks with rotten skin around the injury site and severe trauma to the head and chest. We tried asking him what happened, but all he said was that some animal jumped him in the woods. I remember us all thinking how strange it was, considering the bite marks looked human. And well, after our conversation about how real monsters exist, I started to connect some dots. Maybe he was attacked by something similar and didn't feel comfortable talking about it. A potential pattern was forming, and my mind was eager to put the pieces together. And is he alive? What is his name, and where could I find him? Yes, his name is Leonard Houston. I can send you some of his details, and perhaps he would be willing to shed some light on what happened. Bingo! We finally had solid direction. I was looking forward to going and meeting Mr. Houston to open this thing up completely. I would really appreciate that, Mrs. Alvarez. But before you go, may I ask why take that risk? Why not let it go? I don't know. I think it's because you shared the truth with me, and I felt like I owed some truth back to you. That was good enough for me. I ended the conversation by telling her that if she needed anything, even if it was someone to talk to when the dark thoughts came, I would be here for her, ever. The next step was to take someone to meet this guy. I would have had another detective accompany me under normal circumstances, but this was far from normal. Of all the people I trusted to help me deal with the abnormal, one name was at the top of my list. Officer Ryan was ecstatic to receive the call. Once we got our information on the subject, we immediately set out to find him. The atmosphere on the way was happy. We were investigating a murder, one murder cruel, and we both couldn't stop laughing. As I mentioned before, Ryan had this impact on everyone he came into contact with. I was certainly feeling the stress of finding the person or thing responsible for Ernie Garrison's death. However, all I wanted to talk to him on the way was what anime he was watching and whether or not aliens had visited Earth. Over the years, I have come to attribute many good things to Ryan, but the one thing that stands out is the centering effect it had on me. Hell, in all people. Without him, there is no doubt that I would have already gone crazy. I found myself strangely calm when we arrived at the rundown apartment. Despite the apparent sound of television inside, we had to knock a few times before we heard any movement. Ultimately, we decided to say screw it and yell police to really get his attention. The pale, thin man who opened the door was obviously not happy to see us. He smelled of cigarettes, and beer cans were scattered across his couch. "Whatever you guys are saying I didn't do it because I was busy that night," he said, raising his hands. I cleared my throat. "Is Leonard Houston home?" "He is talking." I took a quick peek behind him and saw that he was alone. "Right. Well, great. Mr. Houston, you're not in trouble. I'm Detective Smith, and this is my partner, Officer Ryan. We're investigating something, and we thought you might be of some help." He sneered. "Boy, do I look like an informant to you?" "Not an informant," Officer Ryan interrupted. "If anything, you would be a hero. Something terrible happened, and we figured you could help us right a wrong." Mr. Houston thought for a moment before inviting us inside. He offered us a place to sit on the couch, but between the beer cans and potential mold spots, we both opted to stay standing. "So," I began, "I heard from a reliable source that you were in the hospital a while ago with some pretty nasty injuries. What was all that?" "Who told you this? I mean, yes, I got hurt badly while taking a night walk, some animal or something. Probably a coyote with mange." "A coyote with mange that had human-shaped teeth and rotted the skin where it bit you?" He shrugged and lit a cigarette. "I think so. There are a lot of strange things out there in those forests." I turned to Officer Ryan and saw him reflecting in my unamused gaze. Turning to Leonard Houston, my tone became a little more serious. "A man has died, Mr. Houston. If you saw something that could help us figure out who or what did this, then I need you to be more honest than saying it was a coyote with mange." His demeanor quickly changed, and the underlying stress came to the surface. "You're in my house. If I said I saw nothing but a coyote, then I saw nothing coyote." "But that is not true," I retorted. "You know it's not. Trust me, I understand that what you saw was probably strange, but we really need your help with this." "Well, perhaps the truth is not meant to be told. I'll be honest with you, sir. I've seen shit in my life. But that day I realized there are some things that are better left good and forgotten. There's no point in trying to convince someone it was nothing more than a mangy coyote. So that was it. I'm sorry I can't help you, but that's all I have." I took another look at Officer Ryan. This time he knew it meant I was begging him to do his thing. Acting on cue, he walked over and placed his hand on Mr. Houston's shoulder, pointed to a photo on the wall, and asked, "Is that your daughter, man?" He nodded in response. "And that's my baby. He turned 6 this month. She is adorable. I always wanted one of my own. Why isn't she here?" Mr. Houston gave a roundabout answer about issues with his mother, but Officer Ryan knew it was more than that. "Forget about the badge for a second. This is just a job, man," Officer Ryan said, pointing to his uniform. "I'm asking like a human. I know you don't know me, but it's still just me, just two guys talking. No judgment. Tell me what's going on." Like clockwork, the Barry fucking Ryan effect happened, and Mr. Houston opened up. I listened silently as the two discussed how Mr. Houston was well aware of his less-than-ideal situation and how he ended up there. After their first encounter in the forest, the stress became unbearable. He was unable to work, began drinking heavily, and as a result, his marriage fell into disrepair. His decision to hide the truth was born out of fear of ridicule. Even if they believed him, he was afraid of introducing anyone to the nightmarish world he desperately wanted to leave. This combination of unfortunate events put him where he was now, an inappropriate place to see your child, even in a limited capacity. And maybe he preferred it that way. Perhaps he wanted to be isolated in his own growing darkness. I couldn't help but feel deeply sorry for him, and to this day, I hope he has found peace. This was the kind of world the boss imagined when he begged me to keep things secret, a world of fear. On contemporary evidence, he was absolutely right. Finally, the conversation turned to Mr. Houston's daughter. Officer Ryan asked a question that really seemed to strike a chord with him. "If we're both here saying we believe in you and are willing to do something, then as a parent, wouldn't you want to help us make the world a safer place for your daughter?" There was a long silence as he tried to organize his thoughts. He lit another cigarette and nodded. Over the next half hour, he went into horrifying details. While walking through the forest at night, he heard a banging noise as if someone was hitting a tree with a sledgehammer. He thought about locating the source of the sound, but as the sound became louder and more aggressive, paranoia set in, and he decided to try and leave. He took off in the opposite direction, but didn't get far before what he said sounded like a battering ram knocked him over. In the dark, he He couldn't see well what was standing over him, but he could make out the outline of a jagged humanoid with a tall head. He didn't have much time to consider what the hell he was dealing with because in an instant it began biting into his flesh and crushing his face. His only means of survival was to draw his pistol and fire a shot into his torso. He heard a loud groan of pain as he staggered back. He knew this was his chance and ran into the night. Someone finally managed to find him on the road, but he passed out on the way to the hospital. When he was fully conscious, he remembered a nurse at his bedside asking what happened. He thought about telling her the truth, but ultimately decided against it. From that moment on, all he would tell anyone was that he was simply attacked by a coyote. Both Officer Ryan and I listened intently as he poured out his trauma. At the end of the conversation, he gave us the location of the forest he was walking through and the specific trail he took. Lo and behold, it was just a few miles from where Ernie Garrison had been murdered. By the end of the conversation, he was crying and repeating the words, "Never come back, stay away." Honestly, I wasn't sure if it was a message for him or for us. We stayed with him until he calmed down, doing our best to reassure him that everything would be okay. Eventually, he calmed down emotionally enough for us to thank him for his cooperation. As we walked out the door, we assured him that we would do our best to use this information to make the world a safer place for his daughter. Still, he made sure to stop us at the door and give us a few parting words. "I don't know what you boys plan to do, but if you go looking for a nightmare, you're sure to find one. Stay safe out there." We agreed and continued. As we walked to the car, the path to solving this case became clear. The biggest question that remained was whether we were dealing with a human or something completely different, but one thing was certain: we needed to examine that forest. But just as we sat in my car to discuss our next move, I heard a call on the radio. Other murder had occurred, this one on the city line. When details of the crime and victims came over the radio, my heart sank and my mind began to reel. A mother and her son were dead as brutally as Mr. Garrison. A deep anger and sadness filled my entire being, and I could barely find the words to respond, opting for a simple "on it" over the radio. Without another word, I sped off into the night towards our new destination. When we arrived at the murder scene, there was a cavalcade of police officers crawling around. Because the crime occurred across jurisdictional lines, the police from our neighboring city also showed up. They were proceeding with their own investigation as everyone tried to determine which city the murder belonged to. Looking through the sea of faces, one in particular stood out to me. In almost any other case, I would have walked up to him with a smile or made a joke to break the tension of the heavy atmosphere. But when I came face to face with the man, all I could ask in a stern tone of voice was, "What the hell happened?" Detective Michael Christian looked at me and simply said, "Smith, this one is horrible," almost as if the devil himself was at work. He asked Officer Ryan and me to accompany him to the house to inspect the bodies. The scene was horrifying. The first thing that caught our attention was that the woman's door had been broken. It looked like someone had used a huge stick to chip the wood and create a hole big enough for a person to crawl through. We had to be careful not to step on the miscellaneous items scattered around as we moved through the house. Detective Christian floated theories about how this looked like a robbery gone wrong, but he wasn't so sure. When we reached the upstairs room and came across the mutilated bodies of a mother and her son, it was clear that this was something much deeper. I'll spare you the details of what it was like, but the comparisons to Ernie Garrison were apparent. I think Detective Christian was starting to talk about how it was likely a personal vendetta that someone tried to hide as a robbery and murder random. But I honestly started ignoring him after the first sentence. I could feel myself getting lost in thought. It felt like the rest of the world was disappearing, and the only other things that existed outside of me were the two bodies staring at me asking, why? Why couldn't I solve this case sooner? Why did they have to be victims of my incompetence? Why wasn't I good enough to make a difference for the first time in my life and make sure the world was actually safer for them? Sweat was forming on my forehead, and it felt like all the air was being slowly sucked out of the room. Because why? I was myself drowning in a sea of questions with no ability to find my way back. And then a new voice broke out. I felt a hand on my shoulder helping my back rise to the surface, and slowly I began to swim out of my own darkness. "Are you okay, friend?" a calm voice said. I turned around and saw Officer Ryan with a deep look of concern on his face. Detective Christian was next to him, but all he showed was a look of confusion. "Yeah," I replied. "I just need some air." Carefully, I left the house with Officer Ryan close behind. I made sure to find a place away from the craziness of the crime scene. It was a struggle to compose myself, and Officer Ryan could clearly read that in my body language. "What's going on, man? You didn't freak out like that in the other scene," he asked. I don't know, maybe the stress of it all got to me for a moment. It felt like everything was hitting me at once, I said. He wasn't buying it. Smith, is there anything you're not telling me? I glanced at him briefly, but remained silent. He sighed. I don't really know what it is, but this whole situation felt different, you know? Stranger than the other cases we've worked on together. He leaned against a nearby tree and turned his attention to the forest in front of us. Did you know my wife is pregnant? What? No, I had no idea. That's amazing, man. Congratulations. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I always wanted to be a father, but it made me think a lot. That's natural, isn't it? I asked. Trust me, every expectant father starts to think, especially when you are in our profession. But that's it, man. After finding the hermit and our other adventures together, I guess I'm just thinking about my own safety. Being a police officer is enough, but there's a real question to be asked about how far we should be willing to go. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He shrugged. I mean, I want to be there for my son's first steps. I want to be there when they say their first word, graduate, get married, etc. And you know what? I want you to be there too. I want to see our children laugh and play together. I want yours to come to me for advice and vice versa. Man, I saw how hard you worked to make sure that boy Lucas was safe. You have a paternal instinct coming out of the wazoo, and I would love to see that in a real setting. But how likely is it to work that way when we're chasing demons all the time? He made a solid point. I didn't have a good answer other than not likely, I suppose. Yeah, you can only get away with these situations so many times, he said. Whoever is responsible for this case is going to do their investigation and probably do a great job of finding the facts, but we know where this is going. Smith, over this time, you have become someone I consider my best friend. Apart from my wife, of course, I love this woman so much. Obviously, whatever you're dealing with personally is difficult, and I'm not going to pressure you about it, but please, as your friend, I'm asking you to consider how far you really want to go with this. Really think about where your limits are. Was he right? I absolutely needed to consider my limits going forward. I didn't realize the emotional toll all this madness was taking on me. Officer Ryan's words would affect me deeply in the future, but still, at that moment, I knew I needed to solve this case. Strangely, this became easier when Detective Christian showed up to break the news. Well, it looks like you guys came here for nothing, he said. It looks like this one is in our jurisdiction, so we'll take the lead here. I nodded and informed him about the murder similar to what we had just a few weeks before. I told him we would provide whatever information we had and would be helpful in any way possible. He nodded and said he appreciated the help. After he left, I offered to take Officer Ryan home. On the way back, I told him how much I appreciated him and that his words didn't go unnoticed by me, but also that I still needed to discover this because there were dimensions that meant a lot to me. He said he understood and simply warned me to be careful, and that he expected me to come back from this relatively unscathed because, in his words, my future children need their uncle. I couldn't help but smile and promise I would come back. The next day, after work, I returned to the crime scene. I spent hours talking to everyone I could about what they saw the night before, hoping someone could guide me in the right direction. At the end of my rope, with no new information, I decided to go back and check again with the neighbors of the family that had been dead. Turns out I had lost a house. The elderly lady inside introduced herself as Mrs. Watson. When I introduced myself as a detective, she seemed confused. Oh, I thought you already spoke to the police. They didn't seem very interested in what I had to say. There have been some new developments in the case, ma'am. I lied. Could you repeat to me what you told us yesterday? What did you see? She thought for a moment before pointing towards the forest. It's not so much what I saw. That's what I know. I'm pretty sure what happened is a result of that. Why do you say that? Well, my great-nephew Boris, he told me he shot something in the leg a few weeks ago that tried to attack him. He didn't know what it was, only that it looked terribly strange. Something limps out of the woods, and the police aren't interested in finding out more? There should be people patrolling this area every night. It seemed strange. Has he seen this thing before? Any chance he knows where they come from specifically? She shook her head. No, I heard stories of strange things coming from there, but he told me he really had no idea what it was. Except there was a horrible moan that he said almost sounded human. I'm not sure, but I swear I heard a very strange human moan last night at the time that girl was dead. Tragic, really. Yes, it is. Well, thanks for your help, Mrs. Watson. If anything new comes along, we'll keep it in mind. With that, I headed back to my car. The pieces of the puzzle were now in front of me. What did I have? What were the facts? 4 attacks, 3 dead, 1 seriously injured, 1 was scared, whatever it was. In both cases with survivors, it seemed like the common link was that these things reacted to being shot. I looked at my pistol and knew I had a means of self-defense. Another connection was that all of these cases seemed to happen near or within a few miles of the forest. Quite a coinciding common denominator. From talking to Leonard Houston, I know exactly which trail to look for. Still, there's a possibility that their crossing paths on that trail was a mere coincidence. Looking at a map on my phone, I discovered the trailhead was directly north of where Ernie Garrison was murdered. Hypothetically, if you walked in a straight line, you would reach the apartment area, head south, and do the same to the mother and her son. Which means that even if the trailhead wasn't exactly where these things originated, it was probably very close. Finally, I had some direction. I contemplated asking Officer Ryan or Detective Joss to accompany me on my foray into the wild. Or I could fake a tip about our killer hiding in the woods to get some backup. We could all go in there and set the forest on fire with a hail of bullets. If you want to call me crazy or irresponsible for my next set of actions, I totally respect that. But I decided I couldn't do that. I certainly wasn't about to put Officer Ryan or Joss in danger of being ambushed in the dark by who knows what. And if I called for backup, I'd have to consider how many police officers would undoubtedly know the truth. Not only would the boss not be very pleased, but what Leonard Houston and Maria Alvarez opined stuck with me. They survived their encounters, of course, one without injury. But the mental scars of knowing what's out there, being aware that you live in a nightmare world where if one monster doesn't take you away, another will, that fuck a person. In Mr. Houston's case, it literally ruined his life. How could I intentionally do this to other people? It just didn't feel right. I understand if you disagree with my reasons, but that's how I felt. That's how I still feel. In my mind, I was doing the right thing. For the next month, I spent every day after work driving around the perimeter of those forests and walking the trail that Mr. Houston had taken when he was attacked. Everything else in my life became secondary, and I was committed to doing that until the problem was resolved. One wet, muddy night, I stopped for a moment and rested on the trail. The physical wear and tear of my routine was affecting me. For a moment, I heard what I thought was a mix of a moan and a whine, and I heard just enough to know it was somewhere in front of me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined the light forward, but I couldn't see very far through the trees. Quickly, the sound moved to my left. This time, a very clear rustling accompanied it. Cursing myself, I drew my pistol with my free hand and aimed directly to the left. I waited in silence, hoping that whatever it was would come out and stare at me, and still nothing. I waited. Seconds turned into minutes, and still there was nothing. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest. I sat down again and tried to control my breathing, attributing the incident to normal forest sounds, probably a small creature that was just passing by. But just as I settled down, another deep human-like groan came rumbling toward me from my left. This time, quick steps towards me followed. I jumped forward, hoping he wouldn't notice my change in direction. I scrambled to my feet and ran behind what appeared to be the vague outlines of a pair of trees. I could hear the thing stomping around, trying to look for me. She let out another disgusting moan before stopping at one point and falling silent again. Fear began to take over my body. I could feel myself wanting to run out of there and never look back at whatever was out there. It took everything within me to fight this primal instinct. I wasn't sure, but I think it was waiting for me to move again. If this thing operated at night, it probably had an excellent sense of hearing. I knew that if I was going to make a move, it would have to be quick and decisive. But at the same time, it was pitch black outside. Furthermore, if I were to act, I would need to shine my flashlight so I knew where to aim, which could also give away my position. In other words, the shots I would take would have to be absolutely perfect, or else he would catch up to me and, well, game over. Turning off the safety and cocking my gun, I took a deep breath and counted softly. 1, 2, 3. I swung the flashlight to where I thought I heard last and shined a light on the ugly creature. I couldn't tell if it was human or something in between. It had a crooked humanoid body that was missing both arms. However, it displayed 2 furry hand-like appendages where its feet should have been. Looking up, I saw that there was a breast flabby while the other side of the chest appeared flatter, with the ribcage showing through the pale skin. But the worst feature was that come of head. The head alone was perhaps 2 feet tall and incredibly uneven, with tufts of hair on each side. His mouth hung open with swollen gums and a row of yellow teeth. As far as I could tell, the thing was also completely blind, as it had no visible eyes. But still, that didn't stop her from staggering towards me while letting out another moan. I didn't even let him get close. As soon as he started coming towards me, I unloaded my pistol at the thing. A shot to the head appeared to stun him. 2, and he began to wobble, staggering on his already weak legs. From there, I kept going again and again and again until he was on the ground and motionless. Silence followed. I let out a giant sigh of relief. Did I do this? I thought to myself, but something about it felt off. I walked over to the carcass and shined my flashlight on both legs. No gunshot wounds or signs of healing. Curious, I turned the body over and examined the torso and found scar tissue from what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his intestine. It had to be what Leonard Houston had found, not what Boris had shot, which meant there was at least one still out there, but how the hell was I going to find him? I shined my flashlight back to where she had initially come from. Walking towards the area, I saw a little man, or I suppose a path made by a creature through the brush. Its large, hand-shaped feet leave noticeable marks on the muddy ground, so I decided to follow him. Eventually, the path came to a culvert big enough to cross, which was partially flooded. I don't believe in life after death, but when I stood at the entrance, it almost felt like a tunnel to hell. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around and never come back, but deep down in my gut, I knew that was exactly where I needed to be. Before making the journey inside, I searched the area for the thickest stick I could find and held it up like a makeshift bludgeoning weapon. Returning to the entrance, I took a moment to control my nerves, recharged my weapon, put the flashlight in front of me, and walked into the tunnel. As I descended deeper, my anxiety increased. Every little sound quickened my heart rate. Every vague shape made me jump back in fear. At one point, I thought I saw a human body face down in the water. When I ran to inspect the naked man, I was shocked to see that it was not a man. In my hands was the corpse rottenness of the damned hermit. His head had been partially eaten, and all the flesh was rotting. It was a horrible sight, but ultimately, I suppose monsters aren't friendly to each other. I threw the body back into the murky water and spat on it before walking away. Continuing my journey, I had the feeling that it would soon come to an end. I thought about the events that led me to this moment. Everything that forced me to become the kind of person who needed to be out there doing the unthinkable. Officer Ryan's words echoed in my head. How far do you want to go with this? Think about what your limits are. As I progressed, I began to question why my limits made me suffer. After this was all over, I needed to think seriously. A familiar groan cut through my internal dialogue. I froze where I was and took a deep breath. Slowly, I took short steps forward. Then the shape of a creature appeared. Walking closer, I saw that it looked like the thing I saw before, albeit a little taller. With a more masculine chest, thicker frame, noticeable black eyes, and more hair growing on the sides of its grotesque head. She also clearly had chunks ripped out of her leg and what appeared to be a golden switchblade stuck in her side. That was it, the creature responsible for this entire journey. He screamed at me and stamped his furry feet into the murky water, but I stood firm. When he saw that I wasn't going to give in, he tried to intimidate me again, puffing out his chest and making his hair stand on end. But I wouldn't be intimidated. I was here to finish this, and he realized quickly. In response, he did something strange. He stopped, spat out phlegm, turned around and began limping in the other direction. There was no way I was going to let him get away. I ran toward the thing, leapt forward into the air, and smashed the bat into the back of its head. It didn't do any damage, but the force easily knocked him down. The thing writhed on the ground, trying to fight. Quickly, I pulled out my pistol and shot the thing in the back. She let out a scream of pain, but I didn't care. Bang, another in your spine. Bang, one on the injured leg. Bang, another on his back. I was boiling. Thoughts about what this thing had done to Ernie Garrison and Boris. What could she have done to the others? And especially what she had done to an innocent mother and her son. My anger started to take over. I stood over her and unloaded all the bullets I had left into her skull, not stopping until I heard the click of a gun. Weapon empty. But I didn't stop there. I turned my body using the butt of my weapon and I hit this thing's face until it was raw. I only stopped when I physically couldn't crush her anymore. And then, silence. I was breathing heavily. I looked at what I had done, examining the thing for minutes, just staring. I don't really know what to do with what I felt. The anger was gone, but I felt empty. I had killed the creature, potentially saving lives, and yet there was nothing. It didn't bring back Ernie Garrison or a young family. Leonard Houston would still be traumatized. Something about it felt empty. Finally, I got up and started to turn to leave, but another sound emanated from inside the tunnel. Shit, I said to myself. Please don't tell me there's another one. I took the rest of my stick and pointed my light forward. I took careful steps toward the sound until I reached the source. I almost choked when I saw 5 grayish-pink miniature versions of the 2 creatures I had killed in a nest of rotting flesh. They were breeding cum, I refused to let the cubs have the chance to be half as dangerous as their parents. With the rest of my weapon, I did what I had to do to end the bloodline. It was finally done. I dragged myself back to my car. I couldn't say what was on my mind. Honestly, I think I was blank. No sense of victory, just blank. My only real thought was how to get out of that damn forest. Arriving at my car provided the most incredible feeling of euphoria I have ever had in my life. I must have sat there for half an hour enjoying the warmth of the heater and the comfort of my seats. Finally, I managed to call the chief and tell him everything. I told him where he could find the bodies and that he could do whatever he needed, but I wouldn't be there to see it happen. I drove straight home and took the hottest shower in the world. 20 minutes later, I changed my clothes and walked to the only place I knew I needed to be, the local bar. The bartender gave me a sympathetic look as I sat down and ordered a shot of whiskey and a cider. I'm sure she had seen a lot of people go through this in her life and could probably spot those who were suffering from a mile away. When she gave me an extra shot of whiskey in the house, it only reaffirmed that she knew I was going through a difficult time. That night, I wanted to do my best to forget everything. 2 shots, and I was well on my way, but just as I was about to let the drunkenness take over, I heard a familiar voice pierce the veil of drifting thought. "Smith, what are you doing here?" I looked over and saw a familiar face staring at me with a wide smile. Detective Joss. Her face was red, and I could see she had already had a few drinks. Evelyn, good to see you here." I played. She laughed and walked over to sit next to me. "I hope you don't mind me using you to get away from creepy, flirtatious drunk guys," she said with a wink. I laughed. "It's not a problem. I never thought of you as a bar person. I like to get dressed up and come here sometimes on Fridays, but I've never seen you here before. What was there? And are you a cider guy? That explains a lot." I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, I don't usually go out drinking alone, but it's been a rough night, I guess you could say. Also, why the hell are you calling me by my last name in a bar? Kind of informal, isn't it?" She shrugged. "I don't know. Honestly, I call you Smith so often I forget what your first name is." I laughed. Debate, Femi Smith. I know it's not a common name, but my mother is Nigerian and my father is from Birmingham. She wanted to use his last name, but we both wanted to stay in touch with our family's African roots through me, so therefore the Nigerian first and second name with an American surname. But when I was a kid, my friends used to call me Dre. She leaned in closer. I could see the genuine interest in his eyes. "Oh, that's fascinating. There's a real story behind your name." I shrugged. I think so, sorry. Is this different? Normally we're taking jabs at each other, fun moves, but blows nonetheless. And now you're here asking about my name? It's just an unexpected change of pace." She pulled back a little and nodded. "Look, I know it's different, and I know that normally I'm arrogant with you. I swear I'm not always that person. In fact, most of the time I'm the complete opposite. Some circumstances make work one of the few places I can keep my mind off, well, life, and I get a little intense." This intrigued me. Taking another sip of my cider, I asked her to tell me what was going on. At first she was reluctant, but with some coaxing, I got her to talk. And it was a lot. Long story short, her father was a cop and not a good cop. Not in the sense that he was terrible at his job, but in the sense that he wasn't a good guy at his job. He was corrupt and power-hungry. The kind of shitface that tarnishes whatever shred of righteousness that badge might have left. And at home, he wasn't much better. Verbal abuse, high expectations, and a cold, distant relationship that she would never forgive him for. She wanted to be better than him. She wanted to be one of the good ones, and, at least in her mind, do something to make up for his mistakes. She threw herself into her work, made sure she was on top of everything that was going on to make sure it was being done right, all well and good. She rose through the ranks, was a star cop, and was living her dreams. Until it came to her home life, she was married once, to a man she thought was perfect in every way. A man she thought she could trust until she found him in bed with someone else. Blame was thrown around. There were arguments every night. Her fault for being too dedicated to her work. His fault for not wanting a family that would give him a reason to slow down. Divorce papers had been filed. A deep depression followed. The only thing left was work, which she now had as her only outlet to keep her mind occupied and away from his thoughts. It was hard to hear that. I tried to offer condolences, but she insisted she didn't need them. Joss was a fighter with body and soul. From a difficult childhood to now, she was determined to find a way to improve her situation and live the good life she always wanted. What followed, however, was a question that struck me deeply. "What about you? I heard you left homicides before I arrived, and now you're back. What happened?" I could have given a bad answer about mysterious, extenuating circumstances or a simple desire to do something different. But Joss had spent the last who knows how long pouring her life out to me. At that moment, I couldn't help but remember my conversation with Maria Alvarez. Truth is due to truth. And so, I gave it to her. I told her about the night my wife and young son were murdered at our house while I was away. I was working on a case and came back to find them dead together in the master bedroom. Of course, the police were called. Empty assurances that we would find the person who did this were made. I drove all over the county looking for clues somewhere, anywhere. I followed every possible lead. I managed to dig past the dead ends. I tripled and quadrupled every bit of information, hoping I could find the person who uses my beautiful family and put a bullet between their eyes. In the end, I never found them. The case remains cold to this day. All we have to go on is grainy footage of a man walking away from the scene. It was only on camera for a few seconds, but I must have spent countless hours watching it over and over again, hoping each time to see something new, something relevant. I've never seen it. Then I left the homicides, unable to deal with the vision of corpses and having a meltdown every time I thought about my family. Joss was in shock. I had no idea. I am really sorry, she said. I told her everything was fine. I had gone through a lot of personal growth to try to move forward. It never leaves you, nor should it. But I was making progress. Over the next hour or so, we bonded over our trauma. Drinking together, we moved from talking about our past to our personal interests. Movies, music, politics, space. Heck, she even told me about a psychedelic trip she took while visiting family in Sweden. Officer Ryan mentioned this before, but she actually was really nice. Eventually, though, like all good things, our conversation had to come to an end. I was exhausted and the alcohol was telling me I needed to sleep. But before I went, she mentioned that her family had a cabin a few hours away. She was initially going to go with some friends, but there was a change of plans, and so she asked if I wanted to go to their place. I told her I would love it. From there, I stepped out into the freezing air. On the way home, I had nothing but time to reflect on everything, and with a smile on my face, I finally let my mind wander. And so the Reddit Skinwalker encounter stories end. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Thanks for watching until the end. If you liked it, like and subscribe if you want to see more.